How do I turn this on? Is it? Oh, it might be on. Okay. All right, I think we'll get started in a couple minutes once everybody gets coffee and sits down. You all can come up if you want. Oh, yeah, you can come up and sit there. Oh,
Yes, because there are
sure.
enough chairs.
Actually, why don't we grab? Should we just grab another? We'll grab another chair. If you, it's up to you. Do you want to sit or do you want to stand? Whatever you want. Okay. Good morning. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm Ament, the president of Student Defense. And for those of you who don't know much about us, we're a nonprofit organization working to advance students' rights to educational opportunity and ensure that higher education provides a launching point for economic mobility. As many of you all know, the higher education landscape continues to evolve. We're seeing a rapid expansion in online education programs with universities across all sectors starting to adopt online program management companies, or OPMs, to deliver education. And even in the past few months, we're seeing a dramatic expansion in the use of AI among online learners and in online program management companies and how they're evolving and delivering education. Over the last few years at our organization, Student Defense, we heard from an increasing number of students talking about issues that they've had while attending higher education programs run by OPMs. Students often sign up thinking they'll get the same education or career benefits of a highly respected university, and often they do, but sometimes they find their programs share little more than a logo with their brick and mortar counterparts. Late last year at Student Defense, we represented and continue to represent online students who sued the University of Southern California and its OPM 2U because USC was inflating data for its US News ranking that 2U was then using to go out and recruit students across the country for their online programs. This is a particularly egregious example, but the phenomenon of highly respected public and private nonprofit universities outsourcing their credibility to for-profit OPM companies is here to stay. Students deserve transparency when making decisions about higher education. While not all OPMs are bad, we need to make sure that our policies are set up to encourage quality, transparency, and accountability. Right now, the Department of Education is rightly reviewing some of its policies, especially those that govern OPMs and other online providers, particularly related to loopholes in the incentive compensation ban that allow OPMs that bundle services to be paid based on the revenue brought in. These are among many issues we're hoping to lean into today and learn from this panel of experts, talking about these issues and exploring the landscape of higher education and online delivery. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Mike Stratford from Politico, our panelists, John Fansmith from ACE, Ajita Talwalker Menon from Calbright College, and Clare McCann from Arnold Ventures. So with that, Mike, I'll kick it to you, and hope everyone enjoys. Thanks so much for coming. And
hey everyone, thanks for having me, and I'm glad to be here. I think this is a really timely conversation because of the things that Aaron mentioned that the Biden administration is considering in this area. But I also feel like it's a debate that has been sort of simmering under the surface for a long time. And I cover education at Politico. We sort of are at the intersection of policy and politics. And the political conversation has sort of heated up around this in the past few years, especially the last year or so. But I know a lot of policy folks have been thinking about this for some time. But for sort of a broader audience, I think it's not something that most people know about, in part because, and maybe we can talk about that, because people might not know that they're attending a program that's operated by an online program management company. And some of the Washington regulatory language is really confusing. I find it confusing that the department has third-party servicer regulations that are different from the student loan servicers, even though it's the same word. So I thought we would sort of start off by getting your thoughts on the state of this industry, exactly what it is. So maybe, John, you could kick us off with talking about how colleges and universities work with, hire, engage these outside companies to help them run their online programs.
Sure. And thank you, Michael. And Aaron, thank you for having me here too. And thank you all for showing up. I would like to say that there's something particularly unique about the relationships colleges and universities have with OPMs, but realistically, OPMs are vendors that colleges and universities outsource services to and enter into contracts with. They offer a range of services across sort of the general area of operations. Outsourcing operations on college campuses is not new or not confined to this area. This has been something that's been growing over the last decades, partly in response to budget cuts, particularly at public institutions, partly in response to demands from boards of trustees and legislatures for schools to be run more efficiently. So there has been a heavier emphasis on outsourcing. OPMs, I think, particularly because of some of the things that Aaron and Michael mentioned, have gotten a lot of attention in the last few years. Concerns about transparency, incidents where students appear to have suffered a bad outcome from their experience with a program that's managed by an OPM. But fundamentally, when you talk about these relationships, really what you're talking about ultimately is the institution's responsibility. What is the program they're offering? How do they go about offering that to students? And how they contract with an OPM is very much reflective of what the institution is trying to do. And they ultimately bear responsibility for what that looks like. In many ways, if we're worried about predatory recruiting by OPMs, we should be, we are currently just as worried about predatory recruiting by other institutions. It's not so much that OPMs represent something unique. It's just a different tool. It can be used appropriately, as it almost always is. It can be used inappropriately, as we have sometimes seen that has happened. It doesn't necessarily mean that operational model is somehow in and of itself at fault. So I think there's a good and kind of an interesting balanced place. We can talk about the regulations and guidance and ways to improve transparency, ways to improve student outcomes. But I would just start by saying that in many ways, this isn't something particularly unique or special in and of itself.
Just to follow up on that, John, can you talk about, is there a general way in which these arrangements between institutions and companies are structured, or is there a lot of variety? Are there certain different models, or what do the agreements and arrangements in broad terms look like between your members and these companies?
Yeah, and that's a good question, in part because I don't know that we can say with any certainty what the answer is. There's a huge diverse range of institutions in this country. OPMs offer a large range of services. The contracts that institutions enter, they're fundamentally contractual relationships. That's the core of the structure of the relationship. But they can, they will vary from campus to campus within campuses. They will vary from program to program. What services the institution's contracting for, what the capacities have, even as we'll talk about a little bit too. What is the revenue model? How is revenue generated? How is it allocated between the two partners in the contract? So it would be easy to say it is X, Y, and Z, but it's not it wouldn't be accurate. And I think one of the things we know about OPMs is we don't know enough about OPMs and their relationships with colleges and universities. There's simply not enough data out there to say with any sort of certainty, these are prevalent trends, this is the dominant relationship, this is what a contract usually looks like. We simply don't know. I mean, the 2U USC contract covered a huge range of issues, including clinical placement, other things. That's not the norm for most of the relationships I've talked to with institutions. That was a very expansive range of services, way beyond what most institutions contract with. Doesn't mean those relationships don't exist on other campuses, just that in that case, it's something that seems outside the norm.
I want to talk more about those relationships, but Ajita, do you want to, stepping back a little bit, the core of this industry is about providing online, or an important part of this, these companies are providing online education. I know your institution does not contract with a OPM per se, but you're an online institution. You think about the sort of quality issues and how an institution might have visibility into how students are learning through online programs. How do you sort of see oversight of that, whether it's happening, it's being outsourced or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think what John said about it relying primarily on institutional oversight is critically important. I think often we see these things make the headlines because something has gone really wrong in the process and the part of an institution, lacking the accountability and oversight for their vendors. And I say that from that perspective because it is also an increasingly and difficult and complex thing to navigate the types of agreements that we're talking about, but also to make sure that it is favorable from the perspective of the institution to have visibility into what is actually happening to students in their programs or in the supports being accessed. And when you take a step back, I think the reliance or non-reliance or the entity itself is not what matters. It is absolutely about how the institution moves intentionally through the process of why they're making the decision to procure different types of technologies or services, who they are doing it for, and the ability for them vis-a-vis the agreements or other mechanisms to have clear visibility about what's happening to their students. So so Calbright College, for those of you who don't know, is a public community college in California that was created to focus on working adults. It's a skills-based program. It's a skills-based college, and it's delivered online statewide. And one of the things that we spend a fair amount of time thinking through before we enter into any agreements is how do those agreements need to serve the students, the outcome of the students that we're supporting. And that is why I think when you couple the act of having folks incentivized to recruit students into a college versus just being responsible for the active delivery or components of the services design or something like that, you're talking about two very different things. One of the most important things that we do is at the front end of the process where we reach and build real relationships with students to guide them through that process. So even if some components of the education, like the content or some aspects of the services, employ an outside vendor, fundamentally, we are responsible and accountable for the full end-to-end experience that our students have. And any agreements with our vendors involve the ability for us to view at a granular level the data associated with our students so we can see how they're experiencing the services regardless of how they're being provided. And I think that's a critical thing that gets missed in a large part of this conversation. So it's what do the agreements say, but also how are institutions holding themselves accountable for the intentional act of procuring those services or embedding those into aspects of their student experience. And if the answer is to outsource the responsibility around quality assurance and or the responsibility for building that initial relationship with the student, that's where we see opportunities and risk for the student with respect to the entrance of predatory practices.
Clare, there's was a lot of attention during the pandemic, rightfully so, on online education as institutions had to switch to online education quickly, haphazardly in some cases. But this conversation about how the federal government oversees online programs has been happening for longer than that, before the pandemic. How do you see these agreements that colleges have with OPMs? There's been a huge growth of them over the past few years. I know you're critical of how the education department is policing those agreements. What do you make of like sort of the state of the industry right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we've seen over the last decade is the public and especially the nonprofit sectors really trying to catch up to the for-profits in online education and trying to, sort of reach the numbers of people that the for-profit sector has been able to reach. And, sometimes that's because the college is looking for a source of revenue, or they're trying to fill an undergraduate class or a graduate class that's a little light. Sometimes they're trying to reach a different set of students, more non-traditional students who maybe can't make it onto a college campus. And I think what we've seen, though, has been a real rush in the space. We've seen public and nonprofit sectors rush in head first on some of this, and not necessarily with the kinds of protections and controls that Ajita is talking about that you would need to see. So, the GAO said more than 500 colleges definitely now have these OPM arrangements. We have seen concerning aspects in some of those contracts, and John is right, we don't know the full extent of it. We don't know how prevalent it is because these are largely unregulated, largely out of view, and out of view on purpose. The goal is to make them look like university programs. And so there hasn't really been as much focus on this sector or as deep an investigation into it as there needs to be.
Well, let's talk about that transparency issue a little more. John, it seems like there are sort of two components of that. There's like the transparency of the arrangement that regulators, maybe accreditors might care about, which is the transparency, and you were alluding to this earlier, but the transparency around how these deals are functioning. But then there's also the transparency from the consumer-facing side, the student, of what do I need to know about this online program that's being marketed to me by probably a brand institution I know, but a company that I may not know. And I've heard, I think Bobby Scott, the top Democrat on the House Education Committee, has raised this as an issue he's focused on, and some of the other concerns coming from Democrats, I think, are focused around the student transparency component. What on both of those issues, what kind of visibility maybe the education department should have into these institutions, and what types of whether it's a disclosure or otherwise, what type of transparency do you think students should have going into these programs?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of the things to think of, splitting up the idea of Department of Education transparency and having a view into these relationships on campuses, looking at the student perspective, what that transparency looks like, I think will probably depend a lot on what that relationship looks like. In many cases, colleges and universities contract with OPMs to do things that are very much operational administrative. They provide the content management system for the program. They, build the back end of managing the course, but they're not preparing content. They're not necessarily doing recruitment. They're not, the range of services is so broad. That does not mean that every campus on every contract is pursuing all of those services. Often they're much narrower. So if you are a student and you're applying to a program, do you really care who's doing the web maintenance? Like, that's not something that fundamentally impacts your education. The other end of that spectrum, though, when you have OPMs that are providing course content, that are doing things like clinical placements, that are doing things like job placements, when it is a much more expansive role, and you can see as a consumer, as a student looking at your options, that may have a material impact on the education, even if it doesn't fundamentally change the quality of education you're getting, but it may have an impact on your decision-making process. There should be a reasonable level of transparency. Schools should let you know what you are entering into. That's just good practice for any institution. And again, that would be true for a physical class on a campus as well as an online class. You should know what you are entering into. You should know who's providing the content. You should know what the courses look like. That's a pretty basic and fundamental amount of transparency that schools should be providing to their students. Again, I don't know that requires a detailed listing of your web services were provided by X, marketing was handled by Y. Only where it's really relevant to the student's experience, I think you need that disclosure, but where it is, it's absolutely essential.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah.
One thing I would say to punctuate it is I don't think often we treat transparency for the purposes of accountability and oversight in the same way that we need to treat it with respect to consumer disclosure. It has to be actionable on the part of the consumer. It has to be something that's understandable to the student or prospective student or learner. And to me, it really does also boil down to the value proposition associated with it. What is the cost and what are the outcomes of the program that I'm going through? So even if we're behind the scenes not being explicit about every aspect of a contractual arrangement, because that's not ultimately information that really can rationally factor into somebody's decision making, we should be upfront and transparent about the cost associated with the programs, the experience that students will have in it. Is it primarily online? Are there supports involved? What structures are in place to ensure their success? Those are areas of transparency that are decisional on the part of a student, and those are areas in which an institution has an acute responsibility to be forthcoming. I think the transparency from the agreements side, the sunshine side, and I can say this safely as a public institution where all of our contractual arrangements are public and accountable to the state of California. I think that is an essential condition for oversight from the perspective of the Department of Education, state regulators, accreditors, those who are involved in that higher level of consumer protection, and those who are responsible for looking at quality from the perspective of the value that it drives for the investments that happen at the state and federal level. So I do want to separate out kind of the need for transparency and disclosure for one purpose, and the need for really disclosing the things that are going to matter to students. And cost and outcome is primarily that thing. And I'll stop there.
Well, what do you think on the student side of that? How would you envision that? I mean, do you think a prospective student knows right now? Probably not. Or B, wants to know? What would someone do with information that this online program that I'm considering is from a brand name institution I knew about before, but it's also operated by this company? Like, what would someone do with that information, or what should they do, or what is the?
Yeah, I don't think that the white label, background that's being provided by a technology provider is going to be particularly helpful in decision making. Right. But as a student, what is going to be important is for me to understand how long is it likely to take me to go through the program? What are the parameters that are governing that? And as a result, what is the consequence in terms of cost or debt associated with that outcome? How probable is it that I'm going to be successful in the program? How probable is it that students like me, or coming from the diverse background that I might come from, if you're talking about our institution, will be likely to succeed? And so I think those are the areas that are important decision points and considerations for students. And I say that from the perspective of actually the thing that institutions don't always do well enough, because we talk about it as marketing and enrollment and kind of these silos of activities, as opposed to putting ourselves often in the student's shoes. Like, to be an actual student-centered institution, you have to be aiming for really testing your prospective students' understanding. And so I think when I say that, what I mean is when you are learning from your students about what is most important to them, and identifying, is it the accessibility of the program? Is it the affordability of the program? What are the things that your students are telling you, prospective students will tell you, are things that are factoring into their decision making, and we need to be responsive from a transparency perspective to those things. And I will say that I'm not saying we shift the burden to students to know what they need to, to ask what they need to know, but they are very good at articulating what is important to them, and it's our responsibility as institutions to rise to that occasion.
And I'll just add, I agree with all of that. But I would say, I was reading about the latest litigation against a school for one of these programs, and they were told the online program had the same faculty, that it had the same curriculum, that it had the same clinical placement opportunities, all of that. And that the allegations in the lawsuit are that they were promised the same product, and they fundamentally were not getting that it was separate faculty hired for the online program. They didn't have the same access to the on-campus faculty that they were getting clinical placements by the OPM and not by the office at the school. So I think it also gets to this broader question of how entwined are these services? Are they paying, are they paying name brand prices for a generic product?
And how would you propose that the transparency, both on the student-facing side and what does the education department need to have?
I think on the student side, absolutely institutions should be making all of this very clear to students, how involved their OPM is. In fact, soon they will have to. New borrower defense regulations clarify what an omission is. And it's going to be an issue for institutions if they are omitting key information about who's actually running their program, offering their program, running their recruitment, all of that. And so there could be potential significant liabilities for institutions if they don't do that. I think on the sort of transparency for the department side, the core question is whether the OPM or whatever entity is providing a service that is core to the school, and whether it's related to a core title for a federal financial aid responsibility, where the company is supposed to be following Department of Education rules. And if they are, the Department of Education needs to know about that so that they can confirm that those rules are in fact being complied with.
In terms of, do you think there needs to be separate active disclosures to students about online program management companies or some of the student-facing disclosures we were talking
so
about?
Much of this is happening implicitly right now. What students are seeing is, someone writing with an email address from the institution, telling them about a program at the institution. They go on the program website, it's associated with the institution. There's maybe fine print all the way at the bottom, powered by OPM. Read more about our partner. All of that is very implicitly designed to give the impression that that is a university program and not a program that the vendor is operating a significant portion of. And so, this is hard. There's not a straightforward boilerplate language. But I think a reasonable person would look at that and say, my impression is that's the school's program.
Yeah, I might just add, it is the school's program. It is fundamentally a program offered by the school. And to the point, the borrower defense rules will apply equally to programs that are offered online through OPMs and programs that are offered physically on your campus. I think that's kind of an important point to keep the focus on, that this model itself is not inherently problematic for students. The case we're talking about was a substantial misrepresentation of what was being provided. That's not the norm. That's what is the issue at fault here. So I think I totally take your point, and I think understanding these relationships and where there might be there might be a need for specific federal interventions or greater accountability in those areas. I think that's a really good conversation to have, but I don't want to get too far into the idea that this model is so unique that it's separate from what institutions' obligations their students are, or that Ajita talked about so clearly.
I also want to talk about the economics of these arrangements and the business model here, because that's been, and I think probably going forward as the administration tries to craft policy around this, one of the sticking points, the more contentious issues. So the education department, as we've talked about, has announced that it's reviewing this policy from 2011, which is called the Bundled Services Exemption Guidance. It's a little wonky, but my understanding of it is there is a general policy set by Congress that there can't be higher incentive compensation in higher ed, that paying people for getting students in the door creates perverse incentives that we want to take away. In 2011, the Obama administration said that the general rule on banning incentive compensation doesn't apply to companies that are offering a bundled package of services to an institution. And so that is sort of the opening that online program management companies have used to create agreements between themselves and colleges that involve revenue sharing, tuition sharing, whatever you want to call it. Basically, the success of the company in getting students in the door and enrolled and paying for these programs is tied to the revenue they receive. So, John, maybe you can start again talking about this from the institutional perspective. What do colleges think of these arrangements? I have to assume at some level they approve of them because they're entering into them. But what are sort of the factors that drive an institution towards a revenue sharing agreement with an OPM, and how do they approach them?
Sure. And as with my earlier comments, there's a lot of diversity to this. There's two different primary models of funding. There's revenue share and there's fee for service. They both have advantages and disadvantages from an institution's perspective, and it's usually tied very much to the structure of the program and institutional resources that are available, and a number of other factors that make a determination about how do we want to proceed. Revenue share is certainly the one that's gotten the most scrutiny, in part because of some of the examples we've seen where there have been abuses. They've been tied to a revenue share arrangement. That doesn't necessarily mean, frankly, that it is a more risky proposition that you can have an abusive fee for service relationship to. It's not in and of itself, those models are not any more subject to abuse or any less subject to abuse. I think you tend to, from an institution's perspective, look at revenue share in a way that's very focused on the risk factor. Revenue share minimizes the risk to the institutions of launching a program because you are paying based on the participation in that program. When we talk to colleges, one of the things they say where they use revenue share agreements is they have a very specific short-term, medium-term, and long-term plan that looks at what are the expectations of participation in that program, what does that mean for generating revenue for the institution, what does that mean in terms of the program they offer, the price to students, things like that. But really, one of the factors is, will we be able to offer a program that we think will have value? We can't be guaranteed that students will be interested in this program. If you're trying to be responsive to your workforce, in the area around you, you may try to stand things up that you have no guarantee will be successful. Institutionally, internally, under enormous fiscal constraints in most institutions, especially public institutions, if you were to say we need several $1 million to stand up a program that we hope in 5 or 6 years will have a sufficient number of students participating that it'll be a sustaining program in terms of the revenue, most university senior administrators would say we don't have the capability to do that. We don't have that. And it's paying for things like training new staff, building new systems, developing the content, hiring the faculty specific to that. Some of those things you have capacity internally to do, faculty certainly, other things. Other parts of it, the upfront costs are simply prohibitive for institutions to do. So they look at revenue share as a way of entering the area with a limited amount of financial risk, always some financial risk too. It's the difference between that and fee for service. Fee for service, you have an obligation over a set period of time to pay a certain amount of money. If your program is unsuccessful, you are in a contract where you're paying out for something that is not of benefit to your students and it's financially hurting the institution. So, the two models, there are pluses and minuses to both. I think what we have talked about, particularly around revenue share, this idea of greater accountability, greater transparency to students, some of these issues, I think that's where the focus should be, less on what the actual revenue model is.
Can I just disentangle two things that I do think are important to clarify? It feels that the sort of unholy alliance of having a recruitment incentive in the first place, which is the guidance surrounding the third-party servicers, and the revenue sharing combined, it can often lead to some of the worst practices that we're seeing out there. So I do think there's an important conversation about decoupling these things a little bit when we're thinking about them. So with respect to if the incentive of an institution is pushing and primarily driven by enrollments, that is often a challenge. And we find that to be a challenge in the public sector as well. Like the fact that enrollments drive primarily how institutions are compensated is an issue because it is not focusing on the throughput of the student or the outcome of the student themselves. When you combine that with the fact that then there's now a financial incentive for an institution to maximize enrollment in a program to get the revenue outcome, that further exacerbates the challenge that we already have in the conventional design and setup of higher ed, which is we're not focused enough on the outcomes of our students. When you add into that the equation that often this comes at a high cost to students because we've increasingly shifted the risk of that enterprise onto students because it is financed through debt and tuition, we're entering a conundrum, you know. And I just want to talk a little bit about the relationship between those things, because I do think those are the things that have to be dissected in order to determine what is in the best interests of students ultimately, in a way that respects the fact that many institutions, especially under-resourced institutions, want to have the capabilities to provide their students with all different types of programs and services that are responsive to changing conditions in the economy and other stuff. So it is reasonable in some respects that revenue sharing arrangements agree for the purpose of covering some of those upfront development costs and other things. But doing that seems very distinct from the act of trying to secure enrollments for the purposes of driving revenue into those programs. So I do think we just want to look at those things in separation, not necessarily look at them in isolation, and in the ways in which they're packaged together that create the primary places where we're likely to see abuse.
Just going back to what you were saying, John, about how institutions find revenue sharing agreements useful for scaling up programs. What about what do you think about the distinction that the 2011 policy makes or allows institutions to make? Am I right that an institution wouldn't be able to use revenue sharing? I guess it wouldn't be called revenue sharing. It would be called paying incentive compensation to their own employees to create an online program if it were being done in-house. What is different about that than a third party doing it?
Well, I mean, the way you laid it out, there wouldn't be much of a difference, but I don't think that's what we have in place right now. We have the bundled services exception. You can't solely contract with an OPM to do recruitment and compensate them on the basis of enrollment. I do think that the bundled services exception is sort of an interesting place where if we are talking about where the federal government could do more, could make changes in policy, looking at more clearly defining what a truly bundled package of services looks like. What are those ratios? Some of the things we hear about from institutions is that, you know, there may be arrangements proposed that are very heavy on the recruitment piece and don't offer a whole lot around that. And that is, you know, skirting the rule, if you will, and it's an area where federally tightening that up would be beneficial. But to your point, yeah, if it was solely being paid to recruit students, that's a clear violation of incentive compensation. That shouldn't be allowed.
Clare, I know you've made that argument that there ought not be a distinction there. Can you talk about your view of the 2011 guidance and why you think it was wrong when it was first enacted?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality of revenue sharing agreements that include recruitment practices is the more students the OPM can bring in, the more revenue there will be, and so the more profit there will be. And the incentive compensation law is extremely clear. It says no incentive compensation. It says you cannot pay people on the basis of their success in enrolling more students. The incentive compensation regulations say the same thing. And so, you know, when the department put that guidance out in 2011, the department's own inspector general said, "Nuh-uh, we don't think that's allowed under the law or the regulations." And they have publicly said that is inconsistent with the law. It's inconsistent with the rules, and it should not have been put into place. You know, so I think, yes, the department does need to do away with the bundled services exception. It has created a loophole that has created incentives. I don't think it's a coincidence that the problems we have seen in the OPM space are associated with revenue sharing agreements. I don't think that's, you know, happenstance that's where that came up. And if institutions want to keep revenue sharing agreements with contractors that don't include recruitment, I would say that's fine. That would not run afoul of anything. But it's this recruitment piece tied to revenue sharing, as Ajita was explaining, that really has created the incentives for some really aggressive, deceptive, and even predatory recruiting practices.
What do you think of John's point about revenue sharing agreements being helpful for institutions to create new online programs? And if I could broaden your point to make one that the online program management companies make, which is that this is allowing them to innovate in higher ed, innovate in the delivery of online education that wouldn't be possible without this type of business model. What do you say to that?
I mean, there's no doubt revenue sharing agreement is a cheaper way for an institution to do this, but we're not just thinking about the cost to institutions here. We also have to think about the cost to students, and we especially have to think about the cost to students. And so I think that's really the bigger question. The opposite of innovation is not consumer protection. You can do both, but it does mean making some trade-offs along the way to find safe ways to innovate, ways that are not going to harm the consumer.
What do you make of what the Biden administration has done so far? They've announced that they're reviewing whether this guidance should remain in place or should be changed. They also put out guidance earlier this year that seemed to try to capture the universe of not just online program management companies, but other types of contractors that universities hire to administer the federal student aid programs. That's run into a bit of trouble for the department. They've backed away from the original guidance they issued in response to litigation from one of the online program management companies to you. What do you, and they've said that they're going to revise that guidance and reissue it. What do you make of their approach so far?
Yeah, I think they're being very thoughtful and taking these very serious issues very seriously. I'm really glad to see them moving to increase the amount of oversight they have into what these arrangements look like. There was a lot of confusion in the field, a lot of pushback. Regulated entities do not love to be regulated. And so lots of pushback from the field. I think they're going to be able to clarify a lot of things in the revised guidance. They've already kind of indicated where that's headed. So I think that will address a lot of the concerns. And then on the bundled services piece, I think they got, I'm still working through all the comments on that, but I think they got a lot of really thoughtful and helpful comments and are giving that serious consideration now. So I've been pleased with their progress. I hope they move very quickly on this, because the more quickly they move, the more time they'll be able to give institutions to kind of rethink their contracts to comply with the incentive compensation rules.
John, AC was critical of the guidance that has now been pulled back and is going to be revised. Can you talk briefly about what the concern was that it seems like was a winning argument with the administration because they decided to pull it back? And also what your view is of the administration's, it seems like separate review of this 2011 policy.
Yeah, so, I think the department realized that they took the wrong tack. And part of that is, and to their credit, frankly, they recognize they took the wrong tack. It points to the complexity of this issue. They were attempting through an expansion of the definition of third-party servicers to capture all of the possible ways OPMs may interact with the campus. The problem is, by casting that net as wide as they did, they dragged in all these other entities that they were not the subject of their concern. And to their credit, they recognized that and pulled that back very quickly after receiving comments on that. I think they understood that they had misdirected their attention. That said, there's going to be negotiated rulemaking on third-party servicers. There is the process around borrower defense. The comments have been submitted. There are a lot of opportunities to do things that are actually narrowly targeted to OPMs in the areas of concern, rather than trying to sort of broaden this regulatory threshold so it's capturing people that aren't the areas that they're interested in. The GAO report talked about some things that were very practical transparency measures, asking auditors to report on relationships with OPMs as part of the annual compliance audit that institutions are doing annually everywhere. Anyway, giving guidance to institutions on identifying what those relationships look like so that they can be aware of what the contracts on their campuses are and work with their auditors to provide greater transparency to the department around those things. Those don't necessarily change the underlying what you can do, but they will give us a better insight into where problems might be occurring and allow for oversight and federal action to address that.
I want to at some point open it up to if anyone has
Yeah,
questions, but go ahead.
One more thing that highlights also what Claire said. I think what is important about the thoughtful approach of the department is that no matter what, when the federal government stands up and says, we're taking a closer look at this, it is a critically important signal to all of us, particularly as higher education institutions, about a reminder of the responsibility that we have to look at these things internally. And so I think if nothing else, one of the most significant things that the department has done is paid attention to this issue and taken a thoughtful approach, as Claire said, to actually get the input to understand how to provide the best suited guidance for institutions who are trying to do the innovative work that they're trying to do, but also reminding us all that it is essential for us to take ownership and responsibility over the arrangements that we have that are affecting our students.
What, Claire, is the department balancing here? Is it the potential disruption? I mean, would you agree that getting rid of this 2011 guidance or significantly changing it would require hundreds of institutions to renegotiate their agreements and redo their agreements? That seems like a huge disruption.
Absolutely. I'm sure the department is balancing the amount of time it's going to take institutions to do that and to implement those changes with the fact that they are seeing concerning practices right now, and they are seeing students raising these concerns. So I think that's the primary consideration: is how can we effectively protect students in the meantime while giving institutions enough of a runway to make the necessary changes.
And John, you mentioned the various, there's negotiated rulemaking, there's this review. Do institutions set aside, obviously there's cost to institutions anytime rules change and they have to adapt, but do institutions welcome an opportunity to change their agreements with online program management companies? Do they want to see some practices sort of off the table as they work with these companies, or what are institutions thinking about as the department thinks about whether they should continue to be allowed to do the revenue sharing?
Yeah, and we've certainly heard from some institutions that they entered into contracts that they now regret. That's not going to be a surprise to anyone, because that happens not just in this area, but in lots of areas, that sometimes contracts are entered into with greater hopes than reality merits, or they're entered into with a lack of understanding of necessarily what the possible outcomes are going to be. That might be particularly acute in this area because there is a bit of an informational disadvantage a lot of institutions have. We don't have a great sense of what our best practices in this area. We don't have a great sense of what standard terms and conditions might be. So these often tend to be individual institutions, even programs within institutions, negotiating in a way where they don't have a clear template of what to do. And I think that is certainly a problem for institutions. So I think additional information that is out there that frankly the Department of Education is well poised to provide would be incredibly helpful for institutions, and frankly help institutions serve their students better and avoid the pitfalls we've seen with some of these arrangements. I do think it's important to think about that in terms of serving the students, because simply prohibiting these types of arrangements blanket isn't necessarily going to better serve students. If the cost of the institution is lower to offer a program, they are much more likely to be able to offer that program at a lower cost to a student. They're going to be able to serve the kinds of students Claire talked about who might be less inclined to come to a physical location. You have to balance a lot of the interests of the students when you're making those determinations. And if the models themselves allow that, that's to the good. You shouldn't bar the model simply because it has been abused. You should look at the ways that you ensure that implementation is being done in a proper way that is serving students, that is protecting the interests of students, and frankly, protecting the interests of the institutions as well.
I think what John said about the importance of helping provide more affirmative guidance to institutions about how to govern the agreements is a really important piece of this. These agreements are very complex. Often an institution is, under-resourced or unaware of how best to position their institution and the students themselves, the outcomes for the students themselves under the best of circumstances. And I think, one of the lessons that I think we've learned as an institution is the deep need to have clear and transparent ownership over the data of students, and to have visibility in any type of arrangement that we have to what's happening with our students. The ability for an institution to have built into the agreements the tools and resources needed to monitor the outcome and the efficacy of those agreements as well. And so I think that there's a number of things like that I think would be really well received by institutions in terms of how those emerging best practices should look to put them in a good position to honor the responsibility and accountability role that they should be playing.
Do you think that guidance or those best practices should come from here, from the feds, or you think of other?
I think there's a great opportunity for the department to do that and to facilitate that conversation, whether formally or informally. Having said that, I will just take note that Claire and I both having been in roles at the department and in prior administrations, that we also have to look at how under-resourced the department and the Office of Federal Student Aid is in this moment. And we should all be advocating for greater resources for them in order to allow them to carry out their duties and responsibilities in a way that is ultimately helpful for the field and ultimately helpful for being in the best interest of our students. And so I think, yes, but I hesitate to task anything largely because I think, the clarity on guidance is important. Their ability to sort of convene folks in this conversation of how to nurture best practices in this space to serve the best interest of students is important. I also think they need to be resourced to do it.
Did you want to respond? Does anyone have any questions? I don't know if we have a mic, but if you want to speak loudly, I can also repeat it for folks watching.
Thank you. Stephanie Hall, the Center for American Progress. So I think the transparency is important, like everyone is talking about, but at the end of the day, the contracts are set up to incentivize the OPM to use a sales model for providing those recruitment services. And that puts students at risk. I'm sad to say I've read over 100 of these contracts, so I know that the USC 2U contract is actually not an outlier. It is not unique. So that's my long-winded comment. My question is, what happens if the current Department of Ed does not revise its policies with regard to incentive compensation? Where does that leave students next year?
I'm glad to say, I think the longer the department lets this issue hang out there, the more years worth of students I think are going to experience the same types of predatory practices, aggressive recruitment, and it may not be I'm quite sure it's not every single program, but the reality is, I agree with you, Stephanie, that revenue sharing has created these incentives. And so it is built in there. It is built into the sort of ethos of how these programs are recruiting. I would also say, I think this issue is not going away. I think we've seen lots of focus from congressional Democrats, from folks outside the department, who are looking at this much more closely, that they, there's a lot of concern about having guidance hang out there that is not consistent with the law. And so, and we've seen lots of focus. I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen focus from both sides of the aisle on graduate student debt issues, and OPMs are heavily concentrated in the graduate space. So I think all of these issues are tied up together and they're not going away.
Yeah, I would add, I think we don't want to go a year and not see anything done. I think there's pretty universal agreement that the federal government needs to do more in this area. Obviously, there's some disagreements about exactly what that looks like, and we have our different perspectives on that. But there is no question this is a large and growing area of operations within higher education that we don't know nearly enough about. And we don't know enough about it from a consumer advocacy perspective or a transparency perspective or a federal oversight perspective. There's simply not enough information in the space that can be used to do proper assessments. I would caution, though, that, you know, I've seen contracts. I know you've seen 100 contracts. There's thousands of these contracts out there across hundreds of institutions, but we don't necessarily know exactly what they look like. It would be wise to at least have some steps first where we're gathering more information, where we have a clearer understanding of what's universally, you know, or what's at least the majority of situations are, before we start thinking what are the alternatives or the decisions we make by limiting these practices.
And I'll just add that I think I think the department and other folks have taken the steps to begin to shine more of a spotlight on that, right? The comments that have been received and asked for by the department, and the opportunity for institutions and other leaders to weigh in on, and student groups to weigh in on how this has affected them, I think all has a hand in shaping that guidance, as do conversations like this.
Anyone else?
Kristen Simplicio, Tico and Zavari. Thank you so much for the panel. It's been great. One question I had is, it seems like you mentioned mostly graduate students, and I think there is some difference between, say, an MBA degree and things like teaching in healthcare, where they're regulated. People have to get licensed in their home states. And in some instances, I think the OPMs are taking on this responsibility of helping people get the right licensing in all their various states when they start advertising one school nationwide. That seems like it has the risk of being very problematic. One, you know, you've got a school in California or Texas or Florida, and they're selling nursing degree programs to people in Connecticut and Montana and Alaska. Are the OPMs really set up to be doing this? You know, making sure when they're recruiting people that they're going to be able to provide the right education, help them get licensed, help them get the clinical license they need. Has this been any, you know, do you think that this is something the OPMs can do? If not, has this been a focus of any of the inquiries or regulatory efforts in looking at them?
So I would say licensure requirements, if you're thinking nationally, are incredibly complex for anyone to do. I'm not sure, frankly, whether there's an OPM that has the capacity to truly do national licensure requirements and preparation. I would say that if you are an institution and you are building out a program that has those requirements in place and your contract relies on the OPM to provide it, you should be doing an incredible amount of due diligence to ensure that they are appropriately prepared to meet the needs of the students they plan to enroll. And if they're not, that you are very clear about either taking that off the table or letting students know in advance you might be only able to do it within the state that your institution is located. Ultimately, that is the institution's responsibility to make sure that they are preparing their students to enter the fields they're telling them they're entering.
It's a related question. It's more of an open-ended comment. For you all to comment. Is that one of the things I feel like I hear discussions about OPMs. They're oftentimes around incentive comp. And then like completely separate conversations around state authorization and the role of organizations like NCSARA. OPMs are inherently, at least like online space. Why aren't we talking about these things more in a related way? What role does, we talk a lot about the department and its role, and maybe 2001 guidance played a role, sort of the growth of OPMs. Where is NCSARA right now in this sort of the state off question, if any?
I mean, I would say, I think we've had lots of distinct conversations about distance education issues. We did a rulemaking on regular and substantive interaction a couple of years ago that was separate from the conversation on state authorization, that was separate from the conversation on OPMs. And I think you're absolutely right. You know, there are these sort of quasi-regulatory bodies. Accreditors are another space where we've seen kind of whisperings or mumblings of some level of concern, but without any real focus on what accreditors are doing in this space and how well they're sort of protecting students in these cases. So I think you're absolutely right. I think a big part of that, though, is the fact that that OPM arrangements have been so largely out of view. That we have very little information on which institutions are partnering with which OPMs and what those arrangements look like and all of that. And I think more transparency would help to sort of clarify that conversation and bring it all closer together.
All right, I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you all for being here. I learned a lot. Appreciate it. Thanks. I wasn't sure if this was new water.